Florence Nightingale would not have become a heroine if she hadn't ventured down the banks of the Bosphorus one November day in 1854. Her fate took a turn in Constantinople as Europe joined forces with the Ottomans in a war of empires. A year earlier, Sultan Abdulmejid I declared war on Russia, which had just sunk part of his fleet. The clash took place between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia wanted access to the Straits. The Ottomans were opposed, but lacked the necessary firepower. That is when France and the United Kingdom stepped in to form an alliance with the Sultan to counter Russian ambitions in the great port of Constantinople. 3 empires against 1. The French claimed their involvement in the Crimean War was to protect Christian communities in the Orient and their interests in the region. As for the British, they wanted to maintain control of the Mediterranean Sea. "310,000 French soldiers and 100,000 British soldiers were mobilized. The Allies won a few battles until the siege of Sebastopol, the largest port in Crimea, where the situation worsened.
The problem is that the war lasted. So in September 1854, a siege began that would last 1 year. And a siege like that is the kind of thing that means losses on both sides. Because the armies that were enclosed, and numerous, were often poorly fed and poorly supplied in terms of water. There was very little drinking water in Crimea. Those armies were going to find themselves with rising mortality rates, due mainly to epidemics, particularly typhus. Nine-tenths of the losses, according to certain statistics, were attributed to typhus rather than battle injuries. Yet there were bombardments, and severe ones at that.
The battles were fierce. Thousands of soldiers, sick and wounded, found themselves trapped by the harsh winter that fell over the Black Sea. For the first time in history, the major British daily, The Times, sent a war correspondent to the front. William Howard Russell made no concessions. He lamented the soldiers left to their fate.
Hear that, Mr. Russell? God help us.
God help us is the cry of the men when they know they are going to the Scutari hospital.
William Howard Russell spent months at the various Crimean fronts. His stories reported everything he saw. Notably, the military hospitals were their scenes of filth and certain death for Her Majesty's subjects.
The Times did an excellent job of reporting. It's the first war that people got news of fairly quickly. It took 10 days by telegraph, as opposed to a ship taking weeks to get the news back.
So the British public, I think, were, at least the middle-class public who were reading the Times, main readership, were, I think, absolutely scandalised. Had it not been for war journalism, actually, then that nothing probably would have happened. That was the main trigger.
Readers will be surprised and angry to learn that no decent preparations have been made for ministering to our soldiers. In our military hospitals, the wounded lie right on the floor itself. They sometimes wait days before receiving first aid. It is an outrage that our soldiers lie dying in such conditions.
Beginning in October 1854, the young Queen Victoria was directly affected by criticism in the press. As sovereign of the United Kingdom, she was head of the armed forces. Her image was tarnished by the high losses amongst her troops. It was a delicate diplomatic affair for the empire, over which she'd held sovereign rule for 17 years. There was public outrage. Voices within the government criticized how the war was being waged. Sidney Herbert, Secretary of State for War, was tasked with putting an end to the bad news making front-page headlines. He turned to a woman he knew well, his close friend, Florence Nightingale. He fought to convince the cabinet to dispatch a group of nurses to tend to the wounded in Scutari, where the largest British military hospital was located, in the outskirts of Constantinople.
There weren't really any other nurses there. There were male attendants, and of course this created a kind of gendered battle from the get-go. War was not a woman's, domain at that time. So it was a big cultural change, an intrusion of women into this male sphere of influence and jurisdiction.
Despite strong opposition to the project, the papers announced the government's decision to send a woman to oversee the care of soldiers in the military hospitals of Turkey. For the first time, the unknown woman's name appeared in the press, Miss Nightingale. After a 3-week journey, she reached the banks of the Bosphorus, leading a group of about 40 women.
The arrival of these first nurses in the field was something new, and up until World War I, it was something that was still taking shape. They had a sort of internalized mission. And of course there was, in the press and in a certain number of circles, a tendency to make fun of them, saying, "Who are these young ladies? What are they going to do over there?" Up until World War I, the status of these women among the men and on the battlefield was always rather ambiguous.
At the time, the nursing profession was in its infancy. For Miss Nightingale and her nurses, the situation was unprecedented. Women had never been on a battlefield before.
But when she got there, she had no idea the extent of the injuries, the number of casualties there were. And when she turned up in this essentially a huge room, the soldiers were all lined up on the floor, no dressings, no sheets, no beds, nothing.
Piled on crude straw mattresses, dying of fever and hunger, the soldiers had little chance of ever seeing England again. Florence Nightingale realized that nothing had been prepared for these soldiers in times of war. The hospital was, in fact, a place to die.
She saw men come in, as I say, with fleas and vermin and excrement in their clothing. I mean, this is appalling. She organized orderlies to take out tubs of feces because they didn't have functioning toilets. Of course she was angry.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 14th of November, 1854. Dear Dr. Bowman, a message came to me to prepare for 570 wounded who are arriving from the dreadful Battle of Balaclava. I always expected to end my days as hospital matron, but I never expected to be a barrack mistress. I take rank in the army as Brigadier General. You gentlemen of England who sit at home in all the well-earned satisfaction of your successful careers can have little idea from reading the newspapers of the horror and misery that reign here. A London hospital is a garden of flowers next to it.
Once she recovered from her shock and anger, Miss Nightingale organized her team of nurses with military discipline. They learned how to tend to patients in emergency conditions and with little means, and grappled with filth and mass contagion.
The nurses were not properly trained nurses. There were very few who were particularly good. There were some who were the exceptions because nursing was a lower class occupation and terrible pay, terrible working conditions. And that was one of Nightingale's missions, was to raise that standard, which started in the Crimean War.
And it took her quite a long time to be able to assert her authority against the military medical men who had held sway before she arrived. It's not a given that this would be a success. Far from it.
Florence was not one to get emotional. In the barracks, she demanded her nurses to exercise restraint and keep their emotions in check.
I cannot allow myself the least careless mistake. There's no room for loose morals or laxness in the barracks. Too many men's lives depend upon it.
If you think about her personality, was she, in today's words, we would probably describe her as an introverted. She would hate any attention. She always shied away from it.
But she had this real sense of identification with people who were much less privileged than herself. So I think that's something to be admired, because let's face it, she could have done many other things, but she chose a pretty tough life and tough road to take.
My dear friend Sidney Herbert, this morning I faced the elements and ventured out to the market, a trip I make almost daily as it's the only way of getting some things. In the hospital, we have no mops, no plates, no knives and forks, no spoons, no scissors for cutting the men's hair, which is practically alive. I'm really cook, housekeeper, washerwoman, and general dealer.
In England, while the government dragged its feet, the Times put out a national call for contributions for the wounded of the Crimea. Donations poured in from all over the country. Boats filled with food and equipment were quickly chartered to Constantinople. Most of the packages were addressed personally to Miss Nightingale.
I think doctors realized that she could get things done. She could do things that their own dreary chain of command, which was horribly complicated and didn't work well, which is another thing she documented in her own report after the war about how disorganized the army was in terms of actually getting the supplies to the right place at the right time.
No soldier deserves to sleep among rats and vermin. To put a stop to the contagion, Florence had the barracks cleaned from top to bottom, ordered additional food, sheets and bedding, drawing from the funds of the Times, as well as her own personal funds. A minor revolution. The laundry room became the nerve centre of the hospital. Here, Miss Nightingale imposed elementary principles, such as clean sheets and dressings, hot water, the best weapons for lowering the mortality rate in the hospital.
It makes sense to us these days, but in the 1850s, this was just not thought about at all.
You need cleanliness, you need clean clothes, and patients feel better when they get them. So that was an absolutely critical change. It's very interesting that Charles Dickens, an important novelist, helped to buy a drying machine. It's all very well to wash the clothing and bedding, but you've got to get them dry.
Her early learning was that people weren't dying of their injuries, they were dying of the infections, and she had to sort out. She also was really insistent on hand washing. She she instantly realised that if somebody had an infection, that was going to soon spread across the others. So she had to sort out some infection prevention and control. So that was what she was instructing people to do in the home. That's really the basis of not hospital care, but also what she was ahead of her time, and nobody really thought about that then.
Hygiene is the main principle for saving lives. In 1854, science had not identified germs and bacteria by name. No one really knew how illnesses spread, but Nightingale relied on her instinct to establish a strict protocol before each treatment.
That was the first, I think, tactic that she deployed, and then built up, cleaning up the barracks and trying to make them into some kind of sanitary state that was acceptable to her. But that must have been just such fiendishly hard work. And it was very slow as well, This didn't happen overnight.
The doctors pointed out how much better off patients were. You need to have all the right environment as well as the actual care with somebody who provides it.
Florence Nightingale's strategy began to pay off. The soldiers' health improved. In the barracks, the mortality rate finally dropped.
The very fundamentals of care, nutrition, hydration, cleanliness, hygiene, putting the patient in the best position for nature to act upon them, which is one of the mantras and aphorisms of Nightingale care, was really to the fore.
But it wasn't enough. Caring for patients also means looking after their mental well-being and breaking their solitude. Miss Nightingale set up periods devoted to writing and reading letters.
These poor fellows bear pain and mutilation with unshrinking heroism. I heard one man say, "I was dreaming of my friends at home."
We know that she certainly wrote letters back to relatives about soldiers who were kind of dying and connecting people and families that way.
Sometimes the family sent that letter to a newspaper, and so those letters appeared. And you can imagine, just what enormous pleasure people would get. The commander, the person's commanding officer, didn't write letters. She was doing something that the British Army didn't do, and families appreciated it.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 12th of April, 1855. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cope, I'm very sorry to have to communicate to you the illness of your poor son. He was admitted and immediately attended to by surgeons, by one of my nurses and myself. He wished very much to have a letter written to you, and 2 or 3 times I went to him for the purpose, but he was always too weak and put it off. He often murmured, "Dear, dear mother," and tried to say many things to you.
In Great Britain, the young Florence Nightingale became an icon, a sort of angel who watched over the kingdom's soldiers. From then on, she became known as the famous Lady with a Lamp. The nickname would follow her whole life. And yet, it was not on the Crimean front that her vocation was born, but long before the war, while she was still very young. She grew up in an England constrained by the archaic social codes of the Victorian monarchy. The Nightingales had made their fortune with quarries and lead mines. They lived in accordance with the principles of upper-class English society, though they were a modern, liberal family. The family lived in a large home in Derbyshire. Florence grew up there with her older sister, Parthenope. Both girls were named after the Italian cities they were born in. Their father, William Edward Nightingale, was a cultivated man. He passed on to his daughters a taste for fine things, literature, Greek and Latin. With no school for girls available, Florence turned to her father's library. She was an advanced child, reading Dickens and the poetry of Victor Hugo.
She had expansive interests across the arts, culture and science, and of course mathematics and statistics, in which she excelled. And she spoke 5 languages.
She discovered a passion for mathematics and would spend entire days locked in the library, despite her mother's concern at such diligence. Florence met eminent visitors in the family home, such as Charles Darwin or Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, founder of the first schools for the blind in the United States, a man who encouraged her to pursue her scientific curiosity. After such an education, she was sure to make an excellent marriage.
So her father had high hopes for her, but there was nowhere for her to take her education. She was totally frustrated that her job as a Victorian young woman was to stay at home, to keep the house, to do the management accounts, to be the host for the potential husband, to look after the children, and effectively read books all day and sewing, which her sister did quite admirably, but she didn't want to do that.
Florence, who was interested in topical issues and social questions, had no desire for that sort of life. What's more, she was religious, and her faith made her strong. At the age of 16, she felt a calling to devote her life to the service of others.
God called me this morning and asked me would I do good for him alone and without reputation. He leads me down paths I do not yet know.
Nightingale experienced what she always called a call to service. Now, we don't know if she heard a voice, actually, but she called it that, and it was to serve.
Turning her back on the life that had been laid out for her, Florence found the courage to stand up for a radical choice. At the age of 25, she told her parents she wanted to become a nurse.
She understood that to become a nurse, she would like to have worked at the local hospital. And indeed, there was a senior doctor who was a family friend who would have looked after her and made it, respectable, as it were. But that wasn't good enough for the family.
At the time, hospitals were for the poor and needy. Florence's parents were horrified at the thought she would frequent this sort of place and pursue work that was inappropriate for a woman of her social standing.
The first idea I can recollect when I was a child was a desire to nurse the sick. My daydreams were all of hospitals, and I visited them whenever I could. I never communicated it to anyone. I would have been laughed at, but I thought God had called me to serve him in that way.
She used to escort her female family members to go and look after the people in the poorhouses. And she realised then that that's what she wanted. But every time she asked her parents whether she could do this, they totally refused.
She had that, not just from her mother, from everybody in the family, her sister particularly. But I think she understood it. I mean, she certainly didn't like it, but she understood it, that this was just a very disreputable thing to do.
To get her to renounce her whimsical project, Florence's parents sent her on a trip, chaperoned by a couple who were family friends. Egypt, Greece, Italy, France, everything to make her change her mind. Curiously, the journey ended far from the beaten tourist path, on the banks of the Rhine, a few kilometers from Düsseldorf.
A few years ago, I had obtained a report of Kaiserswerth. Since then, I had always been wishing to go there, and sometimes when the opportunity was in my very hand, it was taken from me. My sister declared I never should, but the way was opened for me by a curious chain of circumstances.
The detour to Kaiserswerth was not part of the plan. Her parents would have disapproved. But Florence insisted to her chaperones on spending a few days there with one idea in mind: meeting Theodor Fliedner. The reputation of this Lutheran minister with innovative methods had reached all the way to England. Heading a very poor parish, he founded the Order of Deaconesses to allow women to work in his social institution. He founded orphanages and nursery centres, and a hospital school that took in the sick and poor.
Und wahrscheinlich war diese Verbindung von sozialem Engagement.
It was the connection between social work and Christian faith that made Florence Nightingale want to come here, to Kaiserswerth. Because the work Fliedner was doing was completely new and revolutionary.
Man könnte was sagen, revolutionär. Weil in der sehr hierarchischen,
in the extreme social hierarchy of 19th century Germany, there was no question of a woman working outside of the home, in nursing or education, and even less getting involved in the social life of the country. Women had no political role.
Politische Abstinenz eine Rolle.
For Florence, seeing these women at work was a liberating revelation. The deaconesses confirmed her idea that she could do something useful, in complete harmony with her calling.
Fliedner als Gemeindepfarrer.
As a minister, Fliedner considered himself a missionary. Everything he did was founded on faith. For him, the combination of proselytism and social action was fundamental. And this vision that aimed to make society more Christian was essential for Florence Nightingale.
Theodor Fliedner's innovative ideas crossed borders. Deaconess houses opened as far away as the Middle East. Florence convinced her parents to let her return to Kaiserswerth in 1851. She would stay there 3 months. Finally, she would be able to get started.
And Nightingale reports preparations for death, learning how to lay out a body, and she spent time in the apothecary. And you get her notes as to what drugs she learned to prepare there. It was doing important work, and she wanted to work. So it was a great time for her. But in Kaiserswerth, she was thrown into the wards without any supervision, not the way to do it, never talked to the doctor. Nurses didn't talk to the doctor back then. She saw women, deaconesses, doing useful work, but it wasn't trained nursing work.
So I think all of those ideas crystallized and fed into her vision of nursing, which was built on, what we would now call quality improvement, and reforming the character of nurses as a means of improving the quality of care and the people who came into the profession.
After her months among the deaconesses, Florence returned to London. The experiences she'd had during her travels helped her realize what was essential: discipline, medication, the importance of empathy. She was convinced of her calling and renounced the upper-class lifestyle her mother had planned for her.
I hated the idea of being tied forever to a life of society, and only such a marriage could I have. I myself was tempted after several years of resistance. I had never given up the idea of reaching at last a better life than the one laid out for me. I think it was God who saved me from the altar.
She had several suitors, but she would reject them all. Miss Nightingale wanted to work.
When she actually was asked in 1853 to become the superintendent of this small hospital for gentlewomen during illness, very small hospital in Upper Harley Street. She took it. It was her way in. It was the foot in the door. It wasn't where she wanted to be. She would have been in a big, noisy hospital with desperately sick people rather than there. But that was, her family would allow that. And by then she was 33. You know, this is a very long wait.
With the post of superintendent at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Upper Harley Street, Florence imposed her rigor, cleaned up the accounting, and changed the way nursing was practiced. She loved maths and ran statistics on the sanitary conditions at the Institute. No doctor had ever done that before. This is when a letter from the young Minister of War interrupted her course.
I must not conceal from you that I think upon your decision will depend the ultimate success or the failure of the plan. Your own personal qualities, your knowledge and your power of administration, and among greater things, your rank and position in society, give you advantage in such a work which no other person possesses.
And then Elizabeth Herbert, Sidney Herbert's wife, who understood that Nightingale had experienced a call to service, which meant really a call to save lives. Elizabeth Herbert said, "This is your chance. This is it." And Nightingale never hesitated at all. She'd been waiting for this.
That moment determined Florence Nightingale's fate. When the history of the British Empire intersected with a young woman's calling to devote herself to others. She spent nearly 2 years near the front lines, visiting every field hospital and sending daily reports back to England. In just a few months, she drastically lowered the mortality rate at Scutari Hospital. March the 30th, 1856, the Treaty of Paris brought an end to the Crimean War. The British had lost 20,000 men, the French nearly 100,000. Epidemics were 4 times more lethal than the battles, a failure of military medicine that Miss Nightingale would bear witness to.
Dear Mrs. Hunt, I regret I must inform you that your son passed away in the hospital last Sunday. He suffered from chronic dysentery and grew weaker and weaker. He left without too much suffering. We did everything we could to keep his strength up until the end. The chaplain and myself were at his side every day.
I think it made a profound impact on her psychologically, physically, and the rest of her life's work. The imprint that it left was traumatic, I think, and very profound, but a huge motivator at the same time, because she had the most incredible capacity for hard work.
Summer 1856. It was time for the nurses to return to England. Hygiene, disinfection, empathy. Miss Nightingale planted seeds here that would change the face of hospitals in the years to come. She trained the first modern nurses.
The peace treaty was signed. That meant everybody who was healthy could go back as soon as there was a ship to take them. But there were still men in the hospitals, and she did not go back until the last patient left the hospital.
When she left Constantinople, Florence was no doubt one of the most well-known women in Great Britain. The fame made her uncomfortable, especially after being so shaken by her experience in Scutari.
I think it fired her imagination in ways that would have been unimaginable. It fired her motivation to come back and reform the British military health of soldiers and hospitals. And then, you know, transferring those lessons to civilian life and civilian hospitals.
After 22 months in the midst of chaos, Florence returned home as discreetly as possible, under her mother's name, as Miss Smith. While England was celebrating victory, she was reunited with her loved ones, far from the cheering crowds, in the large house at Lea Hurst.
Nightingale did not want to go back as the famous Miss Nightingale. She wanted to work and save lives, and I think she didn't want distractions. This was a matter of faith for her. She was following a mission. You don't follow a mission to get personal gain. You follow a mission to achieve the goals of the mission, which are to save lives and to make things better, to prevent the same kinds of things happening in the future. She wanted to get on with that.
For the mission she'd chosen, Florence would find an unhoped-for ally. In September 1856, she was invited to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the summer residence of Queen Victoria.
Dear Miss Nightingale, you are, I know, well aware of the high sense I entertain of the Christian devotion which you have displayed during this great and bloody war. And I need hardly to repeat to you how warm my admiration is for your services, which are fully equal to those of my dear and brave soldiers, whose suffering you have had the privilege of alleviating in so merciful a manner. From Balmoral Castle, Queen Victoria.
Who knows how those kinds of invitations are made and what lies behind the sort of political kind of motivation, but certainly to have patronage from the Queen and Prince Albert was incredibly helpful. And I think it sounds as if they struck up a very positive relationship. Queen Victoria was a woman of guts and courage as well, and I think they probably saw that in each other.
The tacit alliance formed with the Queen was a stroke of luck for Florence Nightingale. On the advice of her friend Sidney Herbert, she suggested the creation of a royal commission to examine the situation of military hospitals. Several senior officers and politicians were hostile to it. Yet Queen Victoria agreed to an investigation on one condition, that Florence write the preliminary report. It fell to Lord Penmuir, fierce opponent of the project, to make the official request. To a woman, a major first.
Miss Nightingale, 18th of February, 1857. Madam, knowing your devotion to improving the living conditions of our soldiers, I dare ask for your help and additional advice Your experience and personal observations have no doubt provided you with important information concerning the treatment of the sick and wounded, as well as the sanitary needs of the army. It is in this perspective that I am honored today to ask you the favor of sharing the fruits of this experience. It goes without saying that should you accept, they will be considered with utmost consideration. Conclude with, I have the honor of being your faithful servant, Lord Penmuir, Minister of War. That will be all, thank you.
Like Lord Penmuir, ministers and military figures could not get over the concept of dealing with a nurse. But Miss Nightingale was now much more than a nurse. With this report, she would become a well-known and respected public figure in England.
Nightingale really wasn't interested initially she had no notion of reforming. Her life was a desire to make a practical difference to ordinary people.
Driven by her desire to minister to the greatest number, Florence would profoundly transform her country's policies of public health. And the ideas of reform she brought to England would soon cross borders.